Hi, good evening, and thank you all for attending tonight. I'm Laurie Trongone, the Service Line Leader for Women's and Children at Inspira Health. Tonight, our program is brought to you by Inspira's Spirit of Women. Spirit of Women is Inspira's way of reaching out to the women of our community to provide health information in a fun and innovative way. We host events on a monthly basis, including dinner seminars. We have an event called Girls Night Out, and many other fun ways to incorporate health education into what we do. Although, like so many others, we've been forced to go virtual, we hope to return to in-person events later next year. Signing up to be a Spirit member is free and it's easy. You'll notice a window on your screen titled Resources. Simply click on the link labeled Become a Member to ensure you don't miss out on any of our future events. We don't inundate your mailbox, so don't worry. We only send out information on upcoming events and educational information at times. Tonight, we're using the On24 platform again. It is interactive and allows you to resize and move the icons on your screen. You can enlarge the slides by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner. We want you to get the most out of your experience, so make it personal and what works for you. At the bottom of your screen, there are multiple engagement tools that you can use. Using the toolbar, you'll be able to download some resources as well as view our speaker bio. As usual, we encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A button. Your questions will only be visible to our presenters, and your identity remains anonymous if you choose that option. With that said, we hope you'll feel comfortable asking whatever is on your mind. Tonight's presentation is being recorded, and an on-demand version will be available tomorrow using the same audience link you just used. We hope you find tonight's program inspiring and helpful. Now, don't get excited. I know your flyer looks like a martini glass, and if we were in person, that would be your prerogative. But for tonight, we want to give you the ingredients to help reduce stress. Right now, we have even more to be stressed about, right? With COVID-19 and the holidays coming up, it seems as if stress is just a normal part of our lives. We're going to start worrying about eating too much and therefore gaining weight, spending too much money, not having enough hours in the day. I know that's one of my stressors, and just simply running out of time. Of course, we've got COVID-19 as well, fear of getting it or giving it to a loved one. Is it a cold? Is it COVID-19? People have to work remotely. Certainly, people who have children are doing the teaching from home. We're not able to see our loved ones on a regular basis because of COVID-19, and there are a lot of people who've been stressed due to unemployment issues. Certainly, these are trying times. Tonight, we're going to learn what stress is, how we react to it, and some practices that we can use to help us manage the stress in our lives. With that said, it's my privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Stephen Lin. Dr. Lin is the Chief Medical Officer at Inspira Health Vineland and Elmer. He graduated from Dartmouth College, Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and received a master's in public health from Boston University. Before he joined our administrative team, he worked as a hospitalist in Boston. But what brings Dr. Lin to you tonight, though, is the additional training that he's received in mindfulness-based stress reduction and management. He's a certified instructor through the Penn Program for Mindfulness. He will walk us through the techniques that he's learned to help us reduce our perception of and give us the ability to deal with stress. So, Dr. Lin, you want to start us off?
Great. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here and joining us tonight. You'll have to bear with me. There's a lot of new technology that we're all learning these days. Normally, this would be a talk with all of you in the room. So although I can't see you, I know you're out there, and I'm very appreciative that you took the time tonight to be here with us. So let's first of all set an intention tonight to be present. For the next hour, really try to leave some of the things that you've had to deal with today behind you and any of the worries that you might have about tomorrow away for the moment, and just be present in the moment if you can. Remember that the mind likes to fluctuate. It likes to look in the past, which is typically regretting and sometimes glorifying, and often shifts into the present. And that's typically worrying and sometimes planning. So remember that the mind will wander, and we're going to try to set an intention tonight to be here for this talk. If you notice your mind wandering outside the room, try to bring it inside the room. If you notice your mind wandering even in the room, try to bring it within the body, mind, and spirit if you can for this talk. And we're going to start by setting this intention with a 3-minute exercise. It's a brief mindful exercise. So if you wouldn't mind just sitting there for a moment. If you're comfortable and in a position where you can, close your eyes. Your posture should be upright but not stiff. See what's going through your mind right now. Obviously, you're transitioning from what, for all of you, is I'm sure a busy day. So focus on any thoughts or feelings you're having and what is happening for you in this moment right now. Again, whatever is here right now is what you want to focus on. Briefly direct your awareness towards the sensation of breath, feeling the inhale as the air moves in, the exhale as it moves out. Notice the rise and fall of your belly with each breath. And focus for just a second on the breath for this moment. Again, setting an intention to be present. Now expanding the awareness out to the whole body, breathing, sensations, emotions, thoughts, sounds, present to whatever is in this moment. All right? All right, so let's begin. The objectives for tonight, I'd like to describe for you the causes and reactions to stress, help understand how stress can be viewed as a challenge rather than a threat. I'm going to talk a little bit about mindfulness. Again, it's a whole course, but we're going to touch on that briefly. And then I'm going to talk about several mindful practices that you may not be aware of that can help you reduce and manage stress.
So Dr. Lin, can you tell us exactly what is stress?
So basically, your stress is your body's reaction to a challenge or demand. And stress historically was used to describe physical reactions going on in the world. And since about the 30s, we've talked about stress as something that humans endure as well. But the important thing to think about is stress is an emotion. An emotion is something that is a thought, something you're thinking about, but also it's a physical reaction. And that's very important as to the causes and how we deal with stress. So we'll talk a lot about that as well. Stress is, as I said, the body's reaction to change or demands. And what types of things happen in the body when we're stressed? As I mentioned, stress is not just a thought, but it's a physical reaction as well. And if you think about that, you have the heart starts to race, you might sweat or become flushed, you develop a pit or kind of a hollow feeling in your stomach, and you become a little bit extra alert, which obviously makes it sometimes hard to fall asleep when you're stressed. So all these are bodily reactions which are engaging with the thoughts that you're having at that time. So the question is, what are the causes? Oh, sorry, Lori. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. That's what I was going to ask you. What are the causes?
So the causes of stress are everywhere. Obviously, work can be a source of stress. Relationships with your spouse, with your kids, with your friends and family, especially Thanksgiving. I'm sure, hopefully you all had a great Thanksgiving, but sometimes those big family events can be a source of stress. We're in an era of a lot of stress related to politics and things on the news. Health issues can be a really significant form of stress. And obviously right now we're in a pandemic with the COVID-19 situation. Obviously a big source of stress for many folks. The list goes on and on. One of the questions I ask folks is stress greater now than it used to be? Does it seem like stress is building? You know, the answer to that question, I'm not really sure. I don't know what it was like to live in the Middle Ages. I don't know what it was like to live during World War II. Obviously, a lot of difficult times in our human history. But there's no question that many people are feeling increased amounts of stress these days compared to 10, 20, or 30 years ago. One of the reasons I think that is certainly a possibility, actually a guarantee, is the level of technology we have. Technology is a wonderful thing. We love our phones. We love our computers. We love our iPads. The problem with that is we're always connected. We really don't have much downtime anymore. Whenever we have a free second, our first inclination is to grab the phone or log on the computer, see if someone's emailed us. What that means is we're always connected to work, it seems. We're always connected to our family and friends. Again, sometimes that can be a very good thing, but checking your social media posts constantly, believe it or not, can be a real form of stress. So technology and being constantly on is absolutely an indicator of increased stress these days. And there's no question that that some of these devices, while they're fun and enjoyable, are contributing to a lot of stress in our lives. This is a fun cartoon. It says, auto reply, I am dead and will have limited access to email. It seems we just can never get away from these devices.
Isn't that the truth? So what are the ways we typically deal with stress then?
Well, let me go back here. Excuse me. I'm operating the slides here as well. So I love this picture, but the first thing people typically say, again, normally this is an audience I'm talking to, and the first thing people always say is overconsumption of something. Wine, food, cigarettes, substances, obviously, are things that sometimes we turn to when we're very stressed. We also sometimes do shopping for symptoms of stress. Consumption of things feels good initially. And for a moment, it alleviates that stress. But all of us know that it's temporary. And sometimes those habits that we have to deal with stress actually in the long term increase the amounts of stress that we have. Let me get my arrow over here correctly. My computer's acting up a little bit. Excuse me.
Here, I can do it.
There's one. Go one back if you wouldn't mind.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing we do is keep ourselves constantly busy. When we're stressed, we don't really like to be able to sit still and think about what's going on. We come up with activities to prevent ourselves from thinking about the stressful moments and stressful activities in our lives. Again, this is another mechanism we use to avoid dealing with the stress at that moment, but of course doesn't last too long. You'll recognize this picture. I'm sure you've seen yourself sometimes lying in bed at night, hoping you could just go to sleep, but you tend to think, and this is called rumination, when we just think about the stressful activity in our life, the stressful situation that's causing us to just have a difficult time falling asleep, and we think that, boy, if I just think about this problem for another 2 or 3 hours lying here in bed, maybe that will help. Of course, we know it doesn't, and we know it's not productive, but we continue to do it. So rumination is another way that not a helpful way we deal with stress, but again, is part of our stress response. And finally, judging, blaming, putting others down. For some reason, when we're stressed, we tend to be on edge, and by putting other people in a negative situation, it makes us feel a little bit better temporarily. Of course, it's not helpful, but I'd share that when I find someone who's a little bit on edge or being what I would call snarky, one of my first thoughts is, boy, I wonder if that person's having a particularly stressful situation going on in their lives right now. There's a story of a nun I like to tell that joins a monastery to do 15, 20 more years of contemplation, and she's only allowed to say 3 words every 5 years. And after 5 years, she's allowed to speak to the Mother Superior. She goes, and the Mother Superior says, okay, how are things going? And again, she's only allowed 3 words. She says, bed is hard. The Mother Superior says, well, keep practicing. She comes back 5 years later, and her 3 words are, food is bad. Mother Superior says, okay, my dear, keep practicing. She comes back 5 years later and says, I leave now. And the Mother Superior says, I'm not surprised. All you've done is complain ever since you got here. Anyway, normally I'd hear whether there's any chuckles in the room, but I'll keep going if you don't mind. Anyway, those I should share are all the unhelpful ways to deal with stress. We'll talk later about more productive ways we can rise to our stress challenges in life.
So why do we even have stress?
Well, it's important to note that stress is part of who we are. It is not a situation that you're facing at the moment. It's actually how we're wired. If you think about it, it was very helpful when a lion was behind the bushes or another tribe was about to come over the hill and possibly attack us to always be on the lookout for something bad that's about to happen. Again, evolutionary-wise, it is very helpful in how we're wired as human beings. Think of the body response that we talk about. What happens when we're stressed? Our heart races, we start to sweat and become flushed, we become hyper alert, we get that pit in our stomach I was talking about. Recognize that that pit in our stomach is actually the blood leaving the digestive area and going out to our extremities. Why? Because all those responses are allowing us to get ready to what we call fight or flight. We're getting ready to either attack something or run away. And again, from an evolutionary standpoint, extremely helpful. Imagine a squirrel that says, I think I'm just going to lie on this rock for a while and sunbathe, close my eyes, and relax. The lifespan of that squirrel would be very, very short. It's much better for that squirrel to be running around constantly thinking that they must get food, they must look out for predators, and of course that allows them to survive. So that, again, this is part of who we are. You're not unique in having stress. We all have it. It's part of our genetic condition. The problem with that stress response that's so evolutionary helpful are two things. One, it's a very blunt instrument, okay? That stress response, which was getting ready to mount in case that lion came out of the bushes, is the exact response we get when we open our emails in the morning and see an email from our boss and we're like, uh-oh, what's that all about? You'd think that could be a very mild response, but all those triggers, those bodily actions that we're talking about happen in that moment. We open the mailbox, the letter looks like somebody from your ex-spouse's divorce attorney. That whole fight and flight trigger sets in. So that's the first problem with the stress response. It's an extremely blunt instrument. The other problem is it's really not helpful for what I imagine many of you signed in for this hour talk today, is to be at peace. I don't really like to use the word happiness because that has a lot of interesting connotations, but a lot of us would like to find more peace and calmness in our life. And of course, that stress response, which is part of our natural makeup, is actually counterproductive to that. The reason is evolution really doesn't care much about you being at peace and happy. What it wants is for you to survive, to have a chance to have children, and then keep your children alive. And then that's pretty much what, from an evolutionary standpoint, what it cares about. So your happiness, your ability to be calm, to be at peace, to find some joy and meaning inside, it is not really what the evolutionary makeup of our bodies is all about. So we have to come up with some strategies on our own to deal with that. It's really better from an evolutionary standpoint to be constantly on the lookout. We have a negative, what I would call a negative bias. When we look back, we remember the bad things that happened more easily than the good things that have happened. When we're looking into the future, we anticipate problems happening more easily than we imagine good things coming out of our future experiences. Again, from an evolutionary standpoint, that makes perfect sense. But from you trying to get through your day and not have this constant nagging sensation of stress, that's the challenge that we need to deal with. So here's the interesting thing. I'd like to really spend the next part of our talk about stress challenging you to look at stress a different way. And there's a very interesting study that was done that basically asked two questions. First of all, it said, do you feel you are someone who is dealing with high levels of stress or low levels of stress. And the second thing it looked at in 2 years, well, it also asked one other important question, is do you think stress is bad, or do you think stress is not necessarily a bad thing in your life? And you would not be surprised to find out that people who had high levels of stress had a higher mortality rate after 2 years than those people had low levels of stress, right? That's kind of the easy takeaway. The more interesting takeaway is they found that people who had high levels of stress but did not find that stress was necessarily a bad thing, they viewed stress as just part of life, actually had slightly lower levels of mortality than even people who had low levels of stress. The takeaway from that is it's not the stress necessarily that's bad. Remember, stress is part of life. Stress is part of our genetic makeup. The issue is really how we look at stress and then how we deal with stress. That's actually the key takeaway of this study. So for the rest of this talk, I'd like us to imagine stress in a different way, not as something that's bad and should be avoided. And can I handle it? Is this going to overwhelm me? How am I going to deal with this issue? But all stress really means is there's something going on in your life that you really care about. There's something you care about that's at stake, right? Think about it. If you didn't care about these things, if you didn't care about your job, you wouldn't be stressed about your job. If you didn't care about your kids, they wouldn't cause you stress, right? It's the fact that there's something going on that you care about, that you're worried about, that's causing you to be stressed. Now, the trick is optimizing your stress response. Again, if you look at stress, historically, we look at it as a threat. It's something that we should avoid. It's something that's going to crush us if we're not careful. We really need to get out there and try to prevent stress from happening. Well, of course, we know from life experience that preventing stress at work, with our kids, with our spouse, with politics, with health issues, is not possible. So first we're going to say, you know what? Yes, I'm stressed. And that is a normal response. We're going to be kind to ourselves. We're going to recognize that stress is natural. Stress is normal. And the most important thing is we don't want to be stressed about being stressed, right? How many times are you're getting all worked up and you're not only stressed about the situation, but now you're mad at yourself for being stressed. So that's something to avoid. So tend and befriend. Be kind to yourself when you recognize that you're stressed. But ultimately, we want to view, remember, stress means there's something going on in your life that you care about, right? So, and it's probably something that's a potentially bad situation. And I would say, perhaps instead of viewing it as a threat, could you view that as a challenge? Something that is not to be avoided, but something you need to kind of lean into and work on. Something you might need to solve. Maybe not at that moment, but something you need to think about. Again, there's something you care about that's at stake. How are you going to respond to that issue? Here's a quote from Michael Jordan. All of you know him. I've missed more than 9,000 shots in my career. I've lost almost 300 games. 26 times I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot and missed. I've failed over and over and over again in my life. And that is why I succeed. And that is the really key takeaway, because remember, stress is actually an opportunity for growth. It's easy to say that, and we'll talk about why we sometimes don't view it that way. But if you look at what has made you who you are as a person, I would put a fair amount of money that it's not the successes that you've had. We tend to look back on our successes, obviously with appropriate pride and joy, but who you are today is more likely because of the challenges you've had to overcome, the stressful situations in your life that you didn't want, but they came there anyway, and you had to face them. And at the time, although it was very difficult, the fact that you got through that was that opportunity for growth and is what has made you who you are today. That includes really horrible things sometimes, like a divorce or loss of a job, a challenging health issue. None of us want to go through those things. But when we go through them, we often can look back and say, boy, that was an incredible time for growth. And I'd ask you a question. Would you want to meet somebody who never had any stressful or challenging situations in their life? First of all, it's not possible to imagine that being true. But second of all, that would not be a very interesting person in my mind. I would really not be able to learn much from someone who never had to overcome difficulties in their life. So again, stress, flipping it around, viewing it as a challenge and an opportunity for growth. There's a key equation, though, that we have to talk about. In order to view stress as something that is potentially helpful, we have to have resources. If the demands are greater than the resources we have, we will not be able to view that stress as something that is good and that we want to really face and overcome. We will want to cave under that threat, as opposed to if our resources are stronger than those demands, then that's the opportunity to look at it and say, I want to rise to this challenge. A couple key teachings I want to do before we get to some actual resources I want to share with you. First of all spiritual teachings, whatever your faith is, or even if you don't have a specific faith, life is difficult. Life is difficult. We wish it wasn't that way, right? Wouldn't it be great if life wasn't difficult? I'm not sure that's a true statement, but sometimes we imagine that to be a true statement. But everyone teaches us that life is difficult. Life is suffering. Mindfulness came from Buddhism, as many of you may know, 2,500 years ago. And the Buddha said, his quote was, life is suffering. And his actual quote was dukkha. Have you ever heard of, if you ever done any of this work? And dukkha, by definition, is the axle on a cart that's not quite right. So imagine you're trying to push a wheelbarrow, and the wheel isn't quite right. And you're trying to go on a rocky path, and it's just really not easy, right? That is actually the definition of suffering in that. And it's not really suffering, it's more like unsatisfactoriness. So sometimes we're in our life and we're sitting there going, you know what, I'm just not feeling satisfied. There's just this background noise that you're struggling with. And the tendency when that's happening, and this is something we have to overcome, is to resist that moment, is to say, I want this to go away. And again, we talked about some of the strategies we use that aren't productive to deal with that stress. We want to resist that moment. We want to, not only do we want to resist it, we want to get into the next moment. I want this situation to be gone. And we start looking towards tomorrow or the next day and say, boy, I just wish that would arrive. And of course, when that arrives, typically stressful situations are still there. And the ultimate truth is that the only thing that's real is this moment. The past is gone. The future does not yet exist. And when you don't live in this moment, you're kind of missing these key periods of your life that you want to really stay connected to. So again, the key is to accept this moment as it is. Now, that does not mean you don't take action. Some people confuse that. They say, well, geez, I'm accepting these bad situations. No, but you have to accept the fact that the bad situation is happening. It is the reality at that moment. Once you accept that, you're much more capable of leaning into it and saying, okay, now what do I need to do to deal with that situation that I'm stressed about? But trying to resist it, push it away, and hope tomorrow comes and it won't be there anymore is a very ineffective strategy, and which is why mindfulness can be a very helpful tool that we're going to talk about. The other concept I want to share with you is that everything changes. Everything changes. This is, again, a spiritual teaching in all faiths. And the point of that is in a good way. I'll start with the bad way. Actually, I'll start in the good way. Bad things are not going to be bad forever. Bad things are not going to be good. So think of your life and all the bad difficulties that you've had. We've all had them, right? We've all had very stressful, challenging situations in our life. And yes, they ended or they evolved into other things. And the flip side of that coin is, though, good things don't last either, right? So you might have a lot of money in your bank account right now. You might have good health. Things change. So to hold on to those positives, hoping that they will never end, is also a form of suffering because it's not true. It's not possible. Everything changes. There's a story about a guy who won the lottery, and his friends come over and they're like, "Boy, I can't believe how lucky you are. You just won the lottery, and you must be so happy." And the guy basically says, "We'll see." And he goes out and he buys the fanciest car that he always wanted. And he's driving down the highway, enjoying his new car, and a drunk driver comes and smashes into him, and he ends up in the hospital. And his friend comes and sees him and says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe how unlucky you are. You got that beautiful car you always wanted, and on the second day you had it, you ended up in an accident in the hospital." And what does the guy say? He goes, "We'll see." And while he's in the hospital, there's a big, horrible storm, and his house happens to slide in a mudslide down into the ocean. And because he was in the hospital, he avoided that fate. And again, the point being, you don't know when these things are happening, whether they're good or bad. They seem good and you grasp onto them. I get that. But realize you don't know. And more importantly, when bad things are happening, you also don't know exactly what the message is there and what the opportunity is for growth and learning. There's an interesting study that was done looking at people who won the lottery and people who lost a limb. And of course, the person who won the lottery initially was ecstatic and had a brief period of feeling like they were on top of the world. And of course, a person who lost a limb was devastated and likely went through a period of depression. But what they found is after 2 years, and they went back to those people, they found, this may not surprise you if you watch the show I Won the Lottery, or I can't remember the exact title of it, but winning the lottery often did not bring these people a lot of happiness, despite the money that it put in their bank account. And what they found was people who lost a limb, that even though initially it was very difficult, after 2 years they actually were at a period where they had more meaning, purpose, and a sense of ease in their life than those people who had won the lottery. Now, I will admit, I still buy a lottery ticket when it's over a certain amount, and I would certainly not wish someone losing a limb. But the reality is, it's a little bit more complicated than that.
So a major ingredient to handling stress is the ability to be mindful, as you've sort of alluded to so far. Whenever you bring awareness to what you're directly experiencing via your senses or your state of mind via your thoughts and emotions, you're being mindful. Mindfulness has been shown to be a helpful thing for many people in dealing with their stress. So Dr. Lin, tell us, what is mindfulness and how can the state of mindfulness help us deal with the stress in our lives?
So this is usually the audience part of the, actually I have several audience participation parts, but I'll be the audience as well. So when I ask that question, typically people who've had some exposure to mindfulness say presence or awareness. And of course, those are really close definitions of what mindfulness is. But I would say there's two aspects of it. One is being in that moment. And we talked a little bit about that before, about being in that present moment. And the other thing, and this is sometimes missed, is it's accepting that moment for what it is. So it doesn't mean, mindfulness is not just about relaxation. It's actually about connecting with the current moment and accepting that moment for what it is. And to reiterate, it doesn't mean we don't want to change that moment. It just means we accept the reality of that moment and then take action if we feel that is appropriate. John Kabat-Zinn, who is really one of the, is the grandfather of bringing mindfulness practices to the West. And I won't go into details about his background, but he's a very interesting person. But he has a fairly complicated, at least on initial reading, definition of mindfulness. And his definition is the awareness that emerges from paying attention on purpose in a particular way to the present moment and non-judgmentally. Okay? Now there's a lot there, and we're going to break that down. First of all, the awareness that emerges. Okay? And I ask the question, why does awareness have to emerge? And the reality is we're typically not aware. We're typically lost in thought. We're typically, I would say sometimes even in a trance. And a study was done that asked people what they were thinking about at that moment. They had a little buzzer that went off in their pocket. And at that moment, They wrote down what they were thinking about. And about 70% of the time, they were thinking about either something in the past or something in the future. And only 30% of the time were they actually paying attention to what was happening in that moment. So that's why one of the goals of this practice is to have more of that awareness emerge, because it's not our natural state. The next part of it is paying attention on purpose in a particular way. Now, the important part of this definition is I need to share with you that this is not our natural state. Remember, we talked about stress being much more our natural state. And we've got to develop the ability to do this because it is not easy. I use the analogy of going to the gym. Okay? 50 years ago, people didn't go to the gym very much. It wasn't really felt to be something that was helpful. It was a relatively new concept to think that you would go and have exercise and work out. Of course, now we recognize that that is critically important to the health of our body and our well-being and even our mental well-being. I would argue that over the past 10 or 15 years, we've recognized that we need exercises for our mind as well. And that's why we need to develop these skills. So we need to do it in a particular way. It's not our natural state. We need to work at it. And of course, the present moment. We could be aware of a lot of things. We could be aware of our stress and what we're anxious about in the future. But the goal of mindfulness is to be aware of what's happening in that present moment. Another study was done, and they had, again, a similar buzzer go off, and they asked people two questions. One, what are you doing at this moment? And are you at a state of ease, or are you at a state of what I would call dis-ease or discomfort? And what they found was people who were thinking at that, when the buzzer went off and they were focused on what was happening in that moment, they tended to be, and again, I don't really like to use the word happy, but they tended to feel in a happier or more at ease state. And if they were thinking about something else besides what was going on in that moment, they tended to be in a less happy state, in a state of dis-ease. And it didn't matter what they were doing, right? It would be easy to say, yeah, they were paying to the present moment, but they were playing tennis or eating ice cream. But even if they were in line at the grocery store, or they were driving, or they were going for a walk, if they were doing something and they were concentrating on what was happening in that present moment, that tended to be something that was giving them ease or a state of happiness. And finally, non-judgmentally, right? We're our own worst critics. So when we develop these practices, we have to bring to the table the fact that I'm going to do this without adding judgment to myself. I'm not going to beat myself up over this. We're our own worst critics, so be kind to yourself. This is not just another thing on your to-do list, right? That'll just add stress to your day. Oh, I can't believe I haven't done that practice I wanted to do today. It can be relaxing, and recognize that the goal, though, is not necessarily relaxation. It's to be present, to be aware, and to connect with what's happening in your life at that moment. So stop striving and try to let go. And recognize that sometimes when you do these practices, it won't necessarily be good, but it will allow you, I should say, it won't feel relaxation, because if you're having a lot of issues going on in your life that you need to kind of lean into, that might actually be a challenging mindful practice for you to deal with that day. But the goal is to connect with what is.
So can you tell us what are some types of mindful practices?
So the basic, I mean, most people think when they think of mindfulness practices, they think of formal meditation. And certainly that is a form of mindfulness, and I've had a lot of benefit from formal practice in my life, and we're going to talk about a bunch of others. But types of formal practice include a breathing meditation, or what I would call a focused awareness meditation, where you pick an object and you focus on it over and over again, recognizing that your mind wants to wander, right? So the classic example is a breathing meditation. It's called shamatha. And what you do is you basically focus on breathing in and out, and we'll do a similar practice at the end for those who'd like to stay after the talk, and I'll lead you in a meditation. But the key is to recognize that your mind is wandering and just keep bringing it back, you're kind of hardwiring your brain to come back and be able to be in the present moment. Again, recognizing that this is not natural. Our state, our desired state is to want to drift into the past or drift into the future. And so we need an anchor, an object to kind of focus on so we can keep bringing it back to this present moment. But it doesn't have to be the breath. You could focus on a picture. You could focus on a sound. Some people do mantras of some kind. They kind of create their own sound, or they have a sound in the room. But again, this type of practice is a focused awareness practice. The other one is a Vapasana practice, which is one where you remain open to what is going on in that moment completely. So it could be not only your breath, not only what's happening in your body, sounds, thoughts, even emotions, and just trying to lean into those things that are happening within you at that moment. At the same time, you are going to drift away. You're going to recognize that your mind wants to drift into the future or back into the past. Again, I'll repeat, the past is often worry, sometimes glorifying. When you go into the future, you're usually worrying, sometimes planning. And the key of this practice is to just recognize when that's happening and bring it back into the current moment and be openly aware of all that's happening. The final form of practice I'll mention is yoga. Yoga is really using your body and what's happening in your body as an anchor for what's happening in the moment. So those are formal practices. But again, there are classes you can take on that, or a bunch of stuff online, even apps that are available that I'll share with you at the end of the talk. But that's not all mindfulness is. There's lots of less formal practices. For example, mindful eating. Mindful eating is when you typically are not, you turn the TV off, first of all, number one. You may not be talking with people at that time, and you're just focusing on eating. You're recognizing what the food looks like. You're feeling the weight of the food as you're bringing it into your mouth. You're feeling your body react. You notice the saliva starting to form when you smell the food. You notice what it feels like in your mouth. You swallow it. Feels what that sensation feels like. And then after a period of time, you have another bite, right? Well, two really interesting things happen when you do mindful eating. The first, and again, this is where audience participation would normally chime in, and most people get this right. The first thing you notice is you actually enjoy your food, right? You're actually sensing and experiencing the food that you're eating, which is something sometimes we don't do when we're just quickly having a meal while we're watching TV or driving in the car or whatever. The second thing that happens is you actually eat less. Why? Because you're really enjoying your food, and actually you notice when you're full, and you stop eating when you're full. So that's another nice benefit of mindful eating. Another mindful practice is mindful walking. Now that's really where you go off and you say, you know what, I don't have anywhere to go. So you don't want to do mindful walking and say, like, I'm going to mindfully walk. You could mindfully walk. You could do mindfully anything. But typically mindful walking is where you just go off, hopefully in nature, and just notice what is around you. It could be in your neighborhood. Noticing the sounds, noticing the sights, noticing the smells. And guess what happens when you do mindful walking? Your mind still wanders. And you don't say, oops, I'm not doing it well. You say, oh, there my mind goes away again, and you bring it back to what's happening in that moment. Okay? So those are two less formal mindful practices that I highly recommend that anybody can do. But realize anything can be a mindful practice. Remember, mindfulness is connecting with what's happening in the moment and accepting that is what is happening in the moment. And I'll use the example of tennis. When I play tennis, I historically have been fairly competitive when I play tennis, and I am pretty hard on myself. So when I miss a shot, I would get fairly upset, and I would think about it for quite a while. I can't believe I just hit that shot in the net. I can't believe I let this person run up to the net and put it away, whatever it is. So the mindful practice is to say, you know what, the previous point is over. The next point has not yet begun. It doesn't matter what the score is. I'm just going to focus on doing my best in this point, for this shot. sounds easy. It's actually very difficult, especially if you're competitive and you're upset with yourself about the score or whatever shot you had. But that is an incredibly powerful mindful practice that I've discovered for myself. And again, two things happen when I do that. First of all, won't surprise you that I enjoy the tennis match a lot more than when I spend the entire time beating myself up or worrying about what the score is. And the second thing is I tend to win a lot more points, right? I'm focusing on just that point. So I found that to be very helpful. But again, anything where you're noticing that your mind can wander and you bring it back to what's happening in that moment. You could be driving in the car. Typically we're listening to music or we're having lots of thoughts about our day. But try sometime just turning the music off and driving and being in that moment and recognizing what your mind is doing. Recognizing, and when your mind wanders into the future or into the past, just say, oops, there I go again, and bring it back to just the act of driving. So again, anything can be used as an anchor for what's happening in the moment and be used as an informal practice. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is mindful communication. We spend a great deal of our day speaking, and mindful communication is it's a wonderful thing, but also it's a really powerful practice. So for mindful speech, imagine that before you speak, you ask yourself 3 questions. You say, is what I'm going to say true? Not necessarily are you lying or not, but is it true? Because we tend to embellish. Our natural nature is to always be advancing our own agenda, right? We always are thinking about, okay, how is this making me portrayed in the world? And so just ask yourself, is what I'm saying true? Second, is it kind? Is it kind? Now, that doesn't mean flowery. It doesn't mean you're always going to be going around saying kind things to everybody. Even if you're going to be telling somebody, for example, I'm disappointed with how you've been treating me, and I don't really want to spend more time with you if your behavior is going to continue like this, are you giving that message from kindness, or are you giving it from an area of anger, resentment, revenge, whatever negative emotion may be actually clouding that communication? Because you can still give very challenging and difficult messages, but when you do it from whether it's true and kind, it can be much more impactful. And finally, is it helpful? We tend not to like silence. So if we're with someone and there's silence in the room, we tend to say, boy, I'm going to fill that with some speech, and I'm just going to start talking, and what are you up to? How are you doing? And sometimes that's very appropriate, of course. I'm not saying never to do that. I'm just saying be comfortable sometimes with silence, and when you're saying something that's not necessarily adding to the conversation, be comfortable not saying that, and just say, you know what, I think I'll avoid adding that because it's not really adding anything. The more challenging one for us, again, we're pretty good at speaking, right? But the more challenging one is listening, and what I would call doing deep listening or mindful listening. And what do we do typically when we're in a conversation with someone and the other person is talking? We're thinking. We might be thinking of something completely different than the conversation we're in, but more likely than not, we're thinking of what we're going to say. We're thinking of how we're going to respond to whatever might have been said in the past. And while we're thinking, what are we not doing? We're actually not listening to what that person is saying. So mindful communication can be another really powerful practice. And when you're listening, I would share with you, imagine this. Imagine that you look at that person, hopefully a friend, and you say, my friend is talking. I hear the words they're saying. I'm listening between the words and seeing who they are. You're really doing deep listening. If you do that, you will find people will, first of all, be kind of shocked, right? It's not a typical human trait. So when you do deep listening, that will be perceived by the other person in a very powerful way. Practice that with your spouse sometime and see, or have them do a course on this and hopefully come back and do it with you. You'll really appreciate it, I'm sure. But deep listening is absolutely one of the most powerful mindful practices you can do. Now, I have in summary, I would basically say, remember that stress is natural. Stress is part of who we are. We can't avoid stress. We can't not have stress in our lives. So we need to start looking at stress in a different way. We need to recognize the patterns of behavior we have when we're stressed, and we need to come up with some other tools in our toolbox that we can use to help us deal with stress. There are many out there, and as Lori said, mindfulness practices, like I've mentioned, have absolute clinical evidence to show very significant help for people who are dealing with stress. This is basically a brief overview of some of those practices and why mindfulness can be helpful. But I'd like to end there and open it up for any questions that have. I'm not sure, Lori, you're going to have to navigate the questions because as they, here, let me go back. Did I get to the question slide yet? Where's the question slide? I'm sorry. So anyway, that's the talk about stress that I wanted to have with you tonight. And let me see what questions there are. And then I am going to lead a brief practice of Vapasana meditation for those who'd like to see what that experience is like who've never done it, or even those who'd like to join who have. But Lori, let me turn it back over to you and see what questions might be out there.
We actually don't have any questions, so if you would like to now lead the mindful practice session, that would be fabulous.
All righty, great. Perfect timing. All right, so if you've never done a meditation before, the first thing you want to do is you're likely sitting in a chair, so you want to sit upright. You want your back to be upright but not stiff. Your hands should be either palms down on your thighs or folded in your lap, whatever feels most comfortable, and your feet planted on the floor. Now, if you're comfortable, gently close your eyes. And imagine any particularly strong sensations you're having right now in your body. Notice the muscles around your eyes. Loosen them. Perhaps imagining your eyes smiling. Notice if you're holding any particular facial expression. We tend to walk around throughout the day, even sometimes when we're alone, lying in bed at night, we still are holding facial expressions. So let the mouth drop a little bit. Loosen the cheeks. Again, a sense of letting go. Notice if there's any tension in your neck muscles. Again, sense of release. Notice if you're holding your shoulders up. This is another area we tend to hold a lot of stress throughout the day. So let gravity kind of pull your shoulders down. Notice the area around your heart, perhaps noticing your heart beating, noticing any warmth in that area. Bringing awareness to the belly, noticing as you breathe, the belly rises and falls. You're breathing in, you're breathing out. Any sensations of fullness or emptiness. Noticing the seat holding you up. And your feet out on the floor, again, gravity pushing up, the weight of your body pushing down. Just connecting with whatever sensations you're having in your body right now. For a moment, perhaps imagining any of the tension, any of the constriction, any of the holding that you noticed as you went through that brief body scan, letting that all flow out from the top of your head, down through your body, and out through the soles of your feet. Now bringing your awareness to the breath. You're breathing in, you're breathing out. Remember, we talked about how the breath can be a very powerful anchor to this moment. So noticing the sensation of breath, focusing on the air as it flows into your mouth or nostrils, back through your throat, the rise and fall of your belly. And try to pick the area that's most prominent for you in your breathing, and just bring all of your awareness, all of your attention to your active breathing in that area at this moment, right now. Notice that despite the fact you're trying to bring your awareness to your breathing, your mind still wanders. It drifts into the future, it drifts into the past. But when that happens, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong, it's just the way the mind works. The mind secretes thoughts just like your glands secrete hormones. They just come. But when they come, just say, oops, there I go again, and bring all of your awareness, all of your attention back to the sensation of breath. Now bringing your awareness to the sounds. You have the sound of my voice. You might have background sounds in the room you're in. Sounds that are off in the distance. Again, using these sounds as an anchor for you to connect to whatever's happening in this moment, right now. I'm going to ring a bell and just notice the sound of the bell, and notice if you can keep your attention focused purely on the sound. Now bringing your awareness to something that may be a little bit more challenging, but your thoughts. Remember, the mind just keeps producing them, but rather than let the thought carry you away, see if you can see the thought arise, observe it for what it is, just a thought. And as you observe it, notice that as observing it, it often dissolves. And then there's a space between that thought and before the next thought arises. See if you can rest briefly in that space. It's difficult because the thoughts keep coming, but see if you can just sit here for a moment and watch your mind and observe your thoughts. And finally, your emotions. Try to see what emotional state you're in right now. Are you any sadness? Perhaps boredom? Fear? Anxiety? And again, rather than try to avoid it. Just recognize that's what's going on with you right now and lean into that a little bit and be okay with that. Accept that as what's going on with you right now. And finally, recognize that all of these things are allowed. Your sensations, the breath, sounds, thoughts, smells, emotions, tastes, whatever's happening right now is allowed. But imagine yourself sitting on the edge of a river and you're watching all of this go by in the river before you, and you're just able to sit on the bank and not get carried away with all of it. Just observing, being the observer, and allowing it. Remember, the past is gone. The future does not yet exist. All we have at this moment is the present, which is why they call it a gift. And this moment is always right here. You can always connect with it, with the breath or what's happening in your body. It's always right here. You just need to notice. So that's a little challenging to do without folks in the room or able to see any of you. So I hope that experience was interesting. It may not have necessarily been relaxing. It may have been relaxing, but necessarily that's not necessarily the goal. But I would encourage you to find some practices in your life, whether they're mindful practices or other ways you can deal with stress besides some of the less counterproductive ways. Because there's many tools out there. And remember, if the tools in your toolbox is big enough to deal with these stressful events, you can look at them as challenges in life rather than threats and things that you need to avoid. Because unfortunately, we really don't have the ability to prevent stress in our lives or prevent these challenges. They're going to keep coming. So let's work together to develop tools so when they come, we're ready to face them and not have them.
Yeah. So that was wonderful. Thank you. We did have a couple of questions come in. One of them is, first of all, we had lots of people say thank you for the presentation and they enjoyed it. But then one of the questions is, how do you find a way to do this with all the noise around you?
So certainly when you're beginning, it's very helpful to find a quiet place, which is not always easy, but it's very difficult to begin these practices by without that. So finding a quiet room, shutting your office door, trying to minimize some of the distractions and noise. It doesn't have to be for a long period of time. It could be just for a few minutes. Could be for 30 seconds. Could be 2 deep mindful breaths. But certainly finding a quiet place is helpful. But recognize the mindful practice is actually to connect with what is happening in that moment. So you can actually use the noise and distractions as something that you can actually embrace and lean into and not try to push them away. So you don't necessarily have to find a quiet, peaceful place, although initially I would say that's certainly helpful when you're beginning this type of practice.
Yeah. And then one other question. How did you become interested in mindfulness? Obviously, this is a personal question.
One reason, stress. I had, like all of us, again, I'm not unique. I found that I was having a lot of stress and I recognized that I wasn't dealing with it well. And I had someone who I got something from Penn about a mindful course, and I said, boy, that sounds like something that I might be interested in. I'm going to give it a try. And I tried it. It was an 8-week course. The John Kabat-Zinn course is 8 weeks long. It's fairly intensive, but I found it to be very powerful. And I continued to practice and learn. And I said, boy, I'd really like to be able to share this with others, especially down in Cumberland and Salem County. There's not a lot of resources down there, so I thought that would be helpful if I learned. But mostly by learning to teach, I learned it forced me to continue my practice, and I found it very helpful. But the short answer was, like all of us that are on this call probably, we've had periods of stress that we didn't like how we're dealing with it, and I said I'd like to come up with some other ways to deal with my stress.
Right, right. Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and really, I hope everybody has a better understanding of how to handle your stress after this presentation. I would also like to thank Suzanne Bauer and Lauren Clinton for all the behind-the-scenes work that they do to bring you these programs. So as all of us need to do right now, remember to stay home when you can, wash your hands, wear your masks, stay 6 feet apart so that you can stay safe. And thank you again for joining us tonight. And thank you again, Dr. Lynn.
Thank you all.